Okay, so a little bit more interaction. I wonder if anyone might be able to tell me, and I've given a bit of some clues already, but what might this be the definition of? A spoken or written statement that something is true, or proof that something exists or is true. What's that a definition of? A testimony. That's right. So our testimony, that's going to be what I'm sort of talking about this morning. And obviously we've already sort of done a little bit of that with each other, just shared a little bit of a story of our testimony. So in court, a few times where you might hear a testimony, in court, a witness is called to give their testimony of the events surrounding that case. They're asked to give a true account of what they either experienced or witnessed. And this testimony is proof, or used as proof, that that event actually happened. In church, similar style thing, someone might come up the front, or like we've just heard, give a testimony to the congregation. This is a true or spoken account of what God has done in their life. It can serve as proof that there is an existing faith in God in that person or in that situation. So like we've already done this morning, you've given a little bit of each other, a testimony, a little snippet of something that God's done in your life. This is a true event of God's goodness in my life, and it's proof of the existence of God in your life. So I'm sure we all love a good testimony, a really powerful testimony that inspires and shows us God's goodness. One that I think of, and if Paul's got that picture, I might ask him to put it up. This is actually a little secular one. I just thought I'd give an example as it comes up. Many of you will know I'm a school teacher, and I teach phys ed and health education. And in health education, we cover road safety, and so we're trying to get our young people to be safer on the roads when they're driving their cars, etc. So one of the things we do each year is we go to the RAC B Street Smart conference it is. There's a picture of the guy. I'm just going to share a bit about his testimony. This RAC B Street Smart, if there's any students here, Cody, did you go to that back in the day? Yes, I taught Cody. So it's year 10 students go along to this, students from across the state. They go to RAC Arena in the city. So there's probably 10,000 students packed into the building, and they do a live reenactment. It's quite confronting, but they do a live reenactment of a car accident and how the emergency services respond, and et cetera, and I guess part of the day is a little bit, the idea of part of the day is a little bit of shock factor for the kids, that they kind of go, wow, a bit of shock factor, but on the day they also have some people like this man Rob come and share their testimony, their story, the true events of what happened in their life around this. And I've been there a few times, and I'm not sure if you remember him sharing, Cody, or not, but I've been there a few times, and every time I hear him share his testimony, it really moves me. And you can hear a pin drop in RAC Arena when this guy's speaking. So there's 10,000 year 10 students, and this is the power of a testimony. You can get all of them to be completely silent at once while someone's sharing a powerful story. I can't get probably 15 of them in a classroom to be silent for more than about 3 seconds. So he's doing really well. So his testimony, and I apologise that it might be slightly confronting, but I just thought I'd share a little bit of it just as an example. So Mr. Pike, he was 17, or Rob Pike was 17. He was sitting in the rear seat of a friend's car and returning from an afternoon of bowling with friends, Tempe bowling, when the vehicle aquaplaned along Safety Bay Road in Baldivis, spinning out of control and hitting a tree. The car actually split in two, and Mr. Pike woke in hospital thinking he endured a horrific nightmare. The reality was far worse. He discovered the 3 friends he was with had all died in the accident while he had survived. He lost both his legs below the knee and broke his back. He says his feet were in the front half of the car and his body was in the back. So quite confronting there. He woke up in hospital and didn't realise what had happened. I thought I just had a bad nightmare. He says surviving what he describes as a plain and simply as an accident has understandably been very difficult. He says a positive outlook and determination to walk into his school ball inspired his early recovery. For the first few years, he felt guilty about being the only one to survive, and he really struggled with that. His way of dealing it was to be super positive, but he was always searching for an answer. Why did I survive and why didn't one of the other guys? He says he struggled to the point sometimes he found himself wishing that he had died in the accident too, or that if he could substitute his life for one of the others, he would have done that. He's now 31. When this article was written, a few years ago maybe, he was 31. He's got a 3-year-old daughter. He's married. and he's turned his disability to his advantage. He plays professional wheelchair basketball, and he has a business called Equip Industries. And this is the part that I like. He's got this Equip Industries where he takes his story to schools, delivering motivational speeches and imploring children to make the most out of life. He says, my story can influence young people and make a difference in them getting the most out of life and achieving their dreams. When kids listen to my story, my testimony, they are silent and there's a bit of a shock factor. But that's a good thing because it makes them listen and realise that it's not just a story. It's real and it actually happened to me. Like a testimony about our relationship with God. It's not just a story. It's real and it actually happened to me. He says he takes his legs off and passes them around and things, which helps with the shock factor a little bit. But he continues to live by the mantra of inspiring to achieve your dreams, and he wants to travel the world and share his story. He says, I love speaking. I love inspiring kids. It's my passion. So I think that's an example of I guess you could call it you can take the picture down now, thanks Rob, but I guess you could call that a secular testimony, no mention of God or what God's done in his life there. But we've all been inspired, we've all listened to and been inspired by a really powerful testimony. If one like Rob Pike's testimony can effectively inspire people to live a different way through his testimony, how much more can a testimony of God's grace be used to draw people to God? So this morning I want to look at someone else, someone you will know, well-known Bible character. I want to share some of his testimony this morning, and that's the Apostle Paul, and how vital he saw his testimony in reaching others for God. So if you were here about a month or so ago, I started a little bit of a series on Galatians, and I titled it Faith and Love. I'm not sure if, Paul, you can put up that first passage, Galatians 5 and 6. But with Pastor Steve being away regularly, he's asked some of us to sort of preach on a semi-regular basis, so I thought, you know what, if I'm going to preach on a semi-regular basis, I might work through a book, and Galatians was one that has been speaking to me. So I decided to speak through that. It'll be a slow speaking through because I might only preach once a month or so it might take me 6 months to get through it. So hopefully you can remember some of the things as we go through. But last time we touched on Galatians 1 verse 1 to 10. And I titled this series Faith and Love. Have we got that passage yet, Paul? Not yet? Galatians 5 and 6, if we can get that one up. We're not up to Galatians 5 and 6 yet, but when I read through, I sort of thought this passage almost summarises a little bit one of the main messages of Paul's letter to the Galatians. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcised nor uncircumcised has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Are we able to get those on the back wall as well, Paul, for the future ones? I don't have to turn my head there. That's great. So the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And I sort of thought, that's a bold statement, the only thing that counts, but it summarises the book of Galatians and the message in it, I think. So we're going to keep working towards that. So last time, by way of introduction, I asked the question, who was Paul? Who was the Galatian church? When was the letter written? Why was it written? And then we ducked into, so we had some context there, and then we ducked into Galatians 1, verse 1 to 10. And in verse 1 to 10, Paul begins by rebuking the Galatian church. So he's been away and he's heard that they've turned from the gospel that he preached to them. They're perverting this gospel of salvation by faith alone. And he's heard of that and he's written to them and he's opened up with, I've heard this, what's going on, why are you turning from this great news I shared with you? He even says, he instructs them to ignore any other gospel that's put to them. If someone else comes to you and puts a different gospel to you, ignore it. He even says, even if an angel from heaven comes with a different gospel than the one I preach to you, ignore it. And that's a pretty bold statement right there. But that's how convinced Paul is of the revelation from God of the gospel of salvation through faith alone. Last time we looked at what is this amazing gospel of Christ? Why is it such good news? And we sort of asked that question, if it's such good news, why would anyone want to pervert it? If you've been given such an amazing instruction and news, why on earth would you want to change it? And obviously it's our sinful nature to be able to do things out of our own strength that keeps sort of pulling us away from the simplistic nature of faith, salvation through faith alone. So today, we're going to move on from that. So we read Galatians 1 to 10 last time. We're going to pick up at 1 verse 11, and we're going to take a bit more of a chunk this time through to 2 verse 21. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to read through that just now. I hope Paul can follow along with me up there. It's a bit of a chunk, but there's nothing wrong with reading a good chunk of God's word in church, I hope. So let's go through. My Bible's a lot smaller. Galatians 1 verse 11 we're going to pick up. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. But I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. Later, I went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report. The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith. He once tried to destroy it, and they praised God because of me. And then into chapter 2. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. And the last little section here. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separated himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners know that a man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by observing the law, because by observing the law no one will be justified. If while we seek to be justified in Christ, it becomes evident that we are ourselves sinners, does that mean Christ promotes sin? Absolutely not. If I rebuild what I destroyed, I prove that I am a lawbreaker. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing." Amen. So a big chunk of the word there. I hope you didn't mind sort of reading through that with me. But this section of Galatians is often referred to as Paul's autobiography, or his testimony to the Galatian church. If you notice there were some experiences that he shared with the Galatian church. Now, before I go through, I just want to give a reference to the book that's helped me out with this series. I'm no Bible scholar, and while, like all of you, I'm sure we read some passages and we go, yep, that just seems to flow nicely, makes great sense to me. I'm sure we read other passages and we go, well, I think I understand that, but it's a bit confusing. I'm the same, so when I read through Galatians, it's the same for me. So I got recommended to me a book called Galatians for You by an American pastor called Tim Keller, and it's just sort of a study guide to help someone who's looking through the book of Galatians. So some of the stuff that I'm going to share today might be quotes from his book and ideas from there. So he says that, this is like Paul's autobiography. So I guess my question is, why did Paul feel the need at this point in his letter to share his testimony? He's just rebuked the Galatians. He said, I shared this message with you. You're perverting it. You're allowing other people to bring different message to you. And then he goes on straight from there into, well, this is a bit of my life story. It's kind of like, I wonder, why did he do that? And the example I can think of for me as a parent, I feel a bit of the frustration that Paul must have had when he heard the gospel was preached and was being perverted. In my example, in my situation, I might be at home and I witness or hear one of my boys being a bit rude and disrespectful in the way they respond to Amanda or I. And I know that none of your children are like that. It's just my boys. But after a few warnings to change their behaviour, hey, don't do that. There's an instruction, change your behaviour, change the way you're living there, son. It might come to the point where, right, that's enough, off to the naughty spot. That's one of the things we use, off to the naughty spot, sit there for a while, contemplate what you've been doing. I'll then go and have a chat to them. And part of my chat will be an attempt to give them a reason as to why they should change. So why shouldn't you, why, son, should you not be disrespectful and rude to mum and dad? And in part of that, I'll share with them, look, son, my experience is that in life, things will go better for you in life as you grow up if you're nice and respectful and to those people around you. Because I love them, I say, because I love you, son, I want things to go well for you in life. So therefore, I'm sharing a bit of my testimony, what my experience is, so that you can understand, why you should change your behaviour. And I'm hoping by doing that, I'm hoping by sharing my testimony, that little bit of testimony with my son, that he will want to change his behaviour, change the way he's living. And I think for Paul, it might be similar. He instructed the Galatian church on the best way to live. A bit like I'm saying to my son, don't be rude, don't be respectful. This is a better way to live. Paul instructed the church the best way to live is according to the gospel of salvation through faith. Then he hears that they're moving away from that, a bit like my son being disobedient. So Paul writes to them, and it's almost like he feels Paul's best chance of convincing them, keep living according to this gospel of salvation through faith alone. My best chance of convincing them to continue that way is to share what God has done in me, to share my testimony. The power of my story can convince these guys, the power of what God's done in me. So I think that's why he goes on to his testimony. Tim Keller does write, Paul is not sharing his testimony for general inspiration or to point to himself. He's using it to refute the claims of people who wanted to undermine his message, and he wants it all to point to the God of amazing grace. So there's almost two reasons that Tim Keller says that Paul's sharing his testimony here. One, he realised there's people speaking against what he claims as the true gospel, and he wants to refute that, shut it down. But ultimately, and most importantly, he wants it all to point to the amazing grace of God, because he knows that's where the transforming power is that people will be drawn to. So testimonies such as Rob Pike's are powerful and inspiring people, but perhaps, as Keller suggests, that testimony points to himself and how he overcame his trials. Paul's testimony is much more about the amazing grace of God, not through any works of his own. So what I want to do this morning is break up Paul's testimony here that we just read through into three parts. If you notice, as we were reading through, there was kind of three stories, three experiences that Paul sees fit to write and share with the Galatian church. So I thought we'll go through each of those. I might just summarise them briefly so we can capture what's going on, and then think of one point of application that maybe we can share when we're thinking of sharing our testimony with others. So, the first one. In chapter 1, verse 11 to 24, this is the time of Paul's story or his testimony straight after his conversion. He's saying to the Galatians, you know what happened when I was converted? And this time straight after I was converted, this is what happened. And like we said before, he shares this part of his testimony to refute the claims that the gospel was preached to the Gentiles was a word of his own invention. So when he came to preach the gospel of salvation through faith alone, it's like in this section he's saying, look, when I was first converted, this is what happened, and it will prove to you that it wasn't my invention. This gospel of salvation through faith is not something I made up. It's not something I was just taught by someone else. It was direct revelation from God himself. So false teachers in Galatia had obviously come in and they'd begun adding or changing to the gospel that Paul had brought. Perhaps they were doing this by attempting to cause these young Christians to question Paul's credibility. So in verse 13 and 14, if we can have that one, Paul, there's two Pauls. Paul reminded, here we read, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it." On to verse 14. "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers." Why is he sharing this? I believe he's sharing this to say, you've heard of how zealous I was in Judaism. There's no way that what I was going through in Judaism and was researching in Judaism led me to an understanding of the gospel of faith, salvation through faith alone. There's no way. Something had to drastically change in my thinking, and it was only through the revelation of God. So it took a divine intervention, a direct revelation from God for Paul to understand the gospel. Furthermore, in verses 16 to 19, we won't read those, but it says in verse 16 to 19 that Paul waited 3 years before he went up to Jerusalem. So for 3 years after his conversion, he didn't seek out other Christians and say, is this right, what I'm thinking? Is this gospel of salvation? You don't have to do any works. It's through faith alone, through grace in God alone. He didn't seek anyone else out for 3 years. For those 3 years, he received revelation from God alone. So he's saying to these Gentiles, this message I'm brought to you is not from me, it's revelation from God. So I think the reason that Paul shares this part of his testimony, the time directly after his conversion, is summed up in verses 11 and 12. And we might have those ones up, Paul, verses 11 and 12. His first part of his testimony, why is he saying it to the Gentiles? I want you to know, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preach to you is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul finishes this section with a story of traveling to Syria and Cilicia in verses 21 to 24. It says there that those churches didn't know him. They'd heard of him, but I love their response to hearing about Paul's testimony. They praised God because of it. And that's the sign of a true testimony that points to the amazing grace of God. People will praise God because of it. So in that first section, my point of application, when I look at that, I think for us, like Paul, our testimony has to come from the personal revelation from God, and it has to point to his amazing grace. I think if we're going to get up and we're going to share about our lives, or even just share stories of our lives with people, if it points to what I've done, or it points to something that I've made up, or it points to something that I've just heard a preacher say and I'm just regurgitating it out, it's not going to have the power of a testimony that comes from personal revelation from God. So we need to seek that out. And it must point to his amazing grace. This is a cool quote, a good quote that I found. I found it, I wrote it down, and I tried to figure out where it was from, and I couldn't, so I can't sort of give the person the reference, but it says this: the most powerful testimony is our lives reflecting our revelation from Jesus himself. Not regurgitating what others have told us, not merely being taught it. It says, share your story, what God has done in you. This is what the gospel of Christ has done in me. So the first part of Paul's autobiography, of his testimony, straight after his conversion. I didn't get this message from man, directly from God. The next section, you'll notice, starts off with 14 years later. he went to visit the other apostles in Jerusalem. So now we skip forward in his story, his testimony, 14 years later. It's chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, talks about this situation, or this meeting, where Paul travels to Jerusalem to meet the other apostles. And it says that even there, he didn't go to Jerusalem because he didn't believe that his gospel of salvation through faith alone was correct, and I better go up to Jerusalem and check with the other leaders to make sure I'm doing the right thing. It talks about the fact that he went up there. There was two reasons: out of revelation from God. It doesn't say what that revelation was. And secondly, out of fear. He was afraid that he was running his race in vain. So we take from that, in other words, that he was fearful that his ministry was not bearing the fruit that he wanted. So I don't want to be running my race in vain. I don't want to be moving around, planting churches, preaching this gospel of salvation through faith alone to the Gentiles if there's no fruit of my ministry. So I'm going to go up to the leaders in Jerusalem and sort of talk to them, find out, are we united? Are we united on this message? Because I think Paul realized that if they were not united on this message, then his ministry wouldn't be as fruitful as possible. Because then Paul's going out and he's planting churches, telling them, you know what, guys, you don't have to do anything. You just have to have faith in God to be saved and to have fellowship with us. He's going out and telling that message, but if the other apostles in Jerusalem are preaching a message that's something different, actually, you know what, you need to be circumcised, you need to do this, you need to do that, well, then that message is going to get to the people that Paul's reached. They're going to be hearing conflicting messages. There's going to be confusion like there is in this church in Galatians. And there's going to be division. So Paul's ministry is not going to be very fruitful in that situation. So he's going, I want to go up to Jerusalem. I want to meet with these apostles. I want to make sure we're unified on this message. So it's going to be fruitful. It's going to be powerful when it reaches people. So in these verses, we actually get the first indication from Paul of what the false teachers were perverting this gospel with. Up until now in Galatians, we've only heard that Paul's gospel is being perverted. We haven't heard how. But here we hear the first sort of indication, this need to be maybe circumcised, following some of those Mosaic traditions, Jewish traditions. And it's interesting that in this situation, Paul takes Titus with him along to Jerusalem. So Titus is an uncircumcised Greek, or a Gentile, as an example to the leaders of someone who is saved through faith and nothing else. In verse 4 and 5, we see that Paul did this because false teachers have perverted the freedom of the gospel by attempting to make us slaves to works such as circumcision. So Paul's gospel brings freedom, the freedom of the gospel. But these false teachers were coming in and trying to bring people back into being slaves to a works mentality. You must be circumcised to be saved, and so on. In verse 6, if we can have that one up there, Paul. In verse 6, we read, so Paul brings his message to these leaders these apostles and these leaders in Jerusalem. They hear his message, they meet Titus, and here's their verdict. This is an all-defining moment in the early church. In verse 6 we read, as for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God doesn't show favoritism. And here's a very important sentence that we benefit from today. They added nothing to my message. If you imagine for a moment there that they did add something to the message, things could be looking completely different for us today. They added nothing to my message. They saw Titus. They didn't insist that, hang on, you've got an uncircumcised Greek here who's claiming to be saved. They didn't insist that he become circumcised to be saved and have fellowship with them. They welcomed him. They added nothing at all to Paul's message. Once again, Keller writes, if the Jerusalem apostles had sided with or even merely tolerated those who were teaching against Paul, this could have split the church in two. Paul said that the freedom we have in Christ was under threat, and therefore that the very truth of the gospel was at stake. This meeting where Paul went up to those leaders in Jerusalem, this meeting could have ended up splitting the church at a very early stage in its life. Two virtually different religions could have emerged, so no wonder Paul felt fear at this time in his life. He felt the weight of what was going on here. Keller says the stakes could not have been higher. So Paul goes up there, They say, actually, you know what? We agree with what these other teachers have been saying in Galatians. You do need to be circumcised. Paul's saying, no, you don't. All of a sudden, we're going off on two different paths, not unified. The stakes couldn't have been higher. So I think, why does Paul share this part of his testimony? Why does he share with the Galatians this part of his journey? I think it's highlighted in verse 6 to 7, and we've read the first part there. It's for those who are held in high esteem. Just as on to verse 7. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been trusted with preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. So I think he shares this with the Galatian church to say, you know what? Not only did this gospel message come from revelation from God, it's not my own works, but we're also unified with the other apostles in bringing this message. They accepted Titus, an uncircumcised Greek. So that says that there's nothing that needs to be added to the gospel of salvation through faith alone. So what's our application from this one? I think our testimony has to be consistent with the gospel, with the Bible, and ideally with other believers because of what's at stake. If I get up here and share a message, or you're talking to other people about your testimony, and it's contrary to the gospel, like the false teachers in Galatia, I'm going to confuse people. We're going to confuse people. This can cause division. So it's vitally important we don't add anything to the message of the gospel. As I was thinking about this, a story that I thought about recently, I was on the train going to a Scorchers Big Bash game with Lucas. And I was telling man about this afterwards, but obviously, as we all know, you can come across some interesting characters on the train. And I got on the train and there was a guy on the train who was speaking really loudly, and obviously people were sort of unsure what was going on. And at first I was like, what's this guy talking about? And he seemed to be addressing some people opposite him, a guy there with his young kids, and you could see how uncomfortable he was. And I think he said to the guy something like, I'm just trying to have a nice train ride here, mate, or something. And the guy was really quite intently in his face. I was thinking, what's he talking about? And as I was sitting there with Lucas, we kind of moved down a bit further and sat Lucas on this side of me. And as a 7-year-old does, he was like staring like a deer in headlights across, going, couldn't take his eyes off it. I think at one point I kind of said to Lucas, stop looking, matey. He might come and talk to us. But in the end, I was listening along, and I was like, oh, hang on, this guy's trying to share the gospel message to this guy across from him. And he was obviously, I think he might have been on something, and he was a bit all over the shop and things, but he was trying to convince these people opposite him that can they pass his medical test. So he was sort of saying, if you go to the doctor, can you come away with a clean bill of health? But he said, I bet you can't pass my kind of medical test. And it was kind of that way of converting people where you say, you try and get them to realise that they're essentially sick and they need God, kind of thing. So look, I applaud him for where he was coming from, I guess. So they moved on, got off at the next station. I was kind of hoping that he might get off too, but he stayed on. And another young man came on the train and sat down, and he made a beeline straight for him. And I thought, oh, poor guy, I don't know what you're in for, kind of thing. But he sort of started up and introduced him, just said something and said, are you sick or how are you going? I think he said to the guy, how are you going? And the guy said, oh, yeah, okay. And he goes, well, how are you really going? And the guy, to his credit, said, actually, not that great. And there you go, he's already a bit open. And he dived into it, but he said, he got to his part where he says, can you pass my medical test? And he sort of asked 3 questions. And I can't remember, the third one stuck out to me, but the first one was something like, have you ever told a lie, or have you ever... whatever, and the guy sort of went, yeah, I think so, kind of thing, and he said, have you ever, something like, have you ever not cared for someone, or something or other? But then the third one, which it was like, what? That's a bit strange, he came out with, and do you have a wife? And I thought, hang on, that's a bit different. I haven't heard that one before as a criteria for not measuring up to God's, And so I just thought, came in and that's an interesting one. So if you're an unmarried adult male here, then I think you need to probably get on that, because according to this guy, you can't be saved. But I guess in essence, I applaud him for what he was trying to do, but in essence, he got a few of them right. Yes, we do need to obviously not sin against God, but we don't need to be married. But he was trying to, I guess, in one way, he was adding that to the gospel. You need to be married. So I'm fairly sure that none of us would require sort of add the requirement of having a wife to the gospel message of salvation through faith alone. However, you know what? There's a lot going on in our world and our society at the moment that's not in line with a Christian worldview. There's a lot going on in our world that's not in line with what God's original intent was for mankind. And I can get frustrated by that. I know you can. But without getting sucked into it too much, I feel that we need to be careful in our current environment that our testimony doesn't either intentionally or unintentionally lead others to believe that they have to have something else added to the gospel. Lead others to believe that they can only come to faith in God, or that God will only love them once they have turned from these ways that we're getting frustrated by. In doing so, we'd be adding to the gospel that Paul preached, just like they were in the Galatian church. It's not circumcision for us today. I don't think we have to worry about probably saying to people, you don't need, you have to be circumcised. But I think there are other things that we can, maybe unintentionally or intentionally, be adding to the gospel through our testimony. So thirdly, the last part of Paul's autobiography, his testimony, interestingly, he puts in this funny little story about a confrontation with the Apostle Peter after that. So in chapter 2, verse 11 to 21, the third of Paul's stories, he shares a story of an interaction he had with the Apostle Peter in Antioch. So Paul had just been up in Jerusalem. Well, it doesn't actually say whether he was just there or not, but he had been in Jerusalem with the Apostle Peter and some other leaders. And those apostles, including Peter, they had agreed with Paul's gospel of salvation through faith alone. They'd agreed with that. And the implications of that are summarized in chapter 3, verse 28, if we can have that one up there, Paul. So by agreeing, the Apostle Peter, by agreeing with Paul's message, he's essentially agreeing with this as well. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, male or female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. Furthermore, in Acts, if we can go to that passage, Paul, in Acts we read Peter himself testify to this gospel. So Acts 15, verse 5 to 9, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles have to be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, the Apostle Peter got up and addressed them. And he said, brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them just as he did to us. He did this. He did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. So we've got two pieces of evidence that Peter, the Apostle Peter, agrees with this gospel of salvation through faith alone. That's Peter's testimony. He just stood up in front of some people. He shared his testimony, the truth of the gospel. And it seems that Peter was exemplifying this. He was living out what he was preaching. He was eating with the Gentiles. He was fellowshipping with the Gentiles. However, it says that when those that belonged, some people with James came along, they belonged to those people who were still proclaiming that you had to be circumcised. So I think it calls them the circumcision group. Those that belonged to the circumcision group came. It says that Peter drew back and he stopped eating with the Gentiles. It says for fear of criticism. So Paul confronts Peter on this. In verse 13, Paul calls Peter out in front of other people and he calls it hypocrisy. And he says that hypocrisy leads others astray, leads other believers astray, leads non-believers astray. If you're going to preach that the Gentiles and us are one under Christ, but then when someone comes along who doesn't believe the same thing, you're going to draw back for fear of criticism, that's hypocrisy and it's going to lead others astray. After calling Peter out on this, he goes on to then remind him, it's almost like, here you go, Apostle Peter, here's a reminder of what the actual gospel message of salvation is about in verses 14 to 21. So why does Paul share this part of his testimony, this third sort of story that he sees fit to share with the Gentile church? I believe that he shared it to show, or perhaps he shared it to show the Galatians how serious he was about this gospel message. It's not just good enough to believe it, to profess it, you must live it. And Paul saw that so vital that he wasn't afraid to call out the Apostle Peter in front of others. He also seems to use this part of his testimony as a reminder about what the gospel of salvation is about, and that's summarised in verses 20 to 21, if we can have those, Paul. So, summary of this gospel message that Paul's bringing. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God. I don't set aside that it was through grace alone. I don't set that aside and start to say, actually, you need to be circumcised, you need to fill in the blank there. I don't set that aside, for if righteousness could be gained through doing those things, through being circumcised, through not lying, through being caring, if righteousness could be gained through those things, through keeping the law, Christ died for nothing. So our application from this one, our lives must bear witness to our testimony, otherwise we're going to lead others astray. As Paul demonstrated, this is vital. If I stand here and testify of the forgiveness of God, however, then I live in a way that shows people, I don't really forgive others. I'm testifying something like Peter almost and living in a different way. If I do that, I'm not only going to, I could lead others, believers, astray, but I could also push non-believers away from God. I feel that in our day and age, maybe more than ever, people are not drawn by the word alone. If you stand up in front of them and proclaim something, they might take notice, but they want to see you live it. They want to see a life that's consistent with that word. And that's the testimony that people will respond to. So maybe my man on the train, I applaud his zeal to try and draw others for God, and I'm sure it does work, and God uses all kinds of witnessing to draw people to himself. But I think probably if we have the chance, and he didn't have the chance there on the train to share his testimony and then live it out in front of these people, but I think if we can share our testimony of God's goodness in our lives, like Paul did, people will respond to that, particularly if they see it in word and in example. So I think Paul uses his testimony here, in closing, Paul uses his testimony for two main reasons, like we talked about. He wants to refute the claims of the people who are undermining his message, and he wants to point to the amazing grace of God. I believe this morning that his example in this passage can encourage us that our testimony can be a powerful witness to those around us. However, if we want our testimony to be powerful, if we want our testimony to be fruitful, then we need to make sure that it comes, number one, the points of application. Our testimony comes from personal revelation from God, and it always points to his amazing grace in our life, number one. Number two, is our testimony consistent with the gospel and ideally with the other believers so that we are unified, we're not confusing, and we cannot add to it. We cannot say it's salvation through faith alone, but you've got to turn away from this sin or whatever first and those kind of things. And thirdly, our point of application, our lives must bear witness to our testimony. And that's not easy, but we need to be asking God for his grace to enable us to do that so that we can point others to him. So what I thought we'd do today, if the worship team can come up, I want to sing that song, and this was one of those things when it's great when you're up to bring a message and the person who's leading the worship chooses a song that really fits in nicely, and I think that's always that good confirmation that that's something that God wants us to hear about this morning. And so when David's put the song list together and he said we'd do My Testimony, I thought that's fantastic. We're looking at Paul's testimony here to the Galatians, being encouraged in our testimony. So I want to sing that one again in a moment. But I also just want to encourage us in closing that the common denominator of all of our testimonies, and I just want to make sure, Adam, have you unmuted the... Yep, great, we've got everything going, that's great. So the common denominator in all our testimonies, what is it? I don't have the same story as you don't have the same story as me, but the common denominator is the grace of God in our lives. And I want to encourage you because, some of us have miraculous testimonies, and we heard some amazing stories this morning. We've heard them in church before, amazing healings, amazing transformation. And they are such powerful, awesome testimonies. And if you have a testimony like that, I really want to encourage you to share it as much as you can as a reminder of God's transforming power, okay? Because people need to hear about God's amazing transforming power. So if you get a chance in church or in conversation, share that story with people. But I also want to encourage you, if your testimony is a bit more like mine, I grew up in church, and I won't share my whole testimony now, but I grew up in church. I never had a dramatic conversion experience. I've never had one of those massive experiences in my life. It was one of those things, I was blessed to grow up in a Christian family, and God revealed himself to me over time, and there was times in my life where obviously I came into a greater revelation and understanding of who he was and my relationship with him. But if you have a testimony like mine, we can sometimes go, well, I shouldn't go up in church and share because it's not some great dramatic conversion experience. But we shouldn't be discouraged from sharing our testimony. Okay, my testimony, just like that one with the amazing turnaround, has that common denominator. The common denominator of all of our testimonies is the grace of God. The lyrics from the song My Testimony, we're going to sing in a moment, sums it up beautifully. It says, I saw Satan fall like lightning. I saw darkness run for cover. Amazing displays. But the miracle that I can't get over is that my name is registered in heaven. I believe in signs and wonders, and we all do, and we want to see them. We want to hear people stand up here and tell us about signs and wonders of God in their lives. We have resurrection power. But still, the miracle I can't get over is that my name is registered in heaven. So our praise belongs to him forever. So what is our testimony? What is our testimony amongst us all? This is my testimony, the song says. I've moved from death to life. If you don't have an amazing story of healing or whatever, you can tell people, I have moved from death to life. Because grace rewrote my story. And here it is. By Jesus Christ the righteous, I am justified. Not by anything I did, not by circumcision, not by anything I did. By Jesus Christ alone, the righteous, I am justified, and this is my testimony. And then I do like the bridge as well. I think I might have gone off there, but sort of back. I do like the bridge as well. If I am not dead, then he's not done. Greater things are still to come. So if you're here today and you don't have a testimony of God's amazing grace in your life, you're still here, you're not dead, then God's not done. He can do a great work in your life. If you're like me, and sometimes I yearn for that miracle experience in my life. Well, I'm not dead, God's not done. Greater things are still to come in my life, in your life. I believe. So this morning I hope you're encouraged by Paul's testimony. I'm sure the church in Galatians was encouraged by his testimony. They were challenged and convicted in this message of we are saved through salvation in Christ alone. So let's stand with us if you will. We'll finish by singing this, declaring this out this morning, and then we'll have some fellowship together.